You'll never know the fear of losing someone like you if you're someone like me.
Misery. Whether you're a fan of the movie or the books, I think we can all agree it's an absolute banger. Paul Sheldon, a best-selling novelist, becomes trapped by his #1 fan, Annie Wilkes, after a car accident leaves him incapacitated. This psychological thriller was first published in 1987 and then was brought to the big screen in 1990 by Rob Reiner, and it features incredible performances by James Caan as Paul Sheldon and then Kathy Bates as Annie Wilkes, who actually won an Oscar for her performance.
I'd like to thank the Academy.
If you've seen the movie and you think to yourself, yeah, I already know this story, I promise you, right? I promise you, you don't. In this video, I'm going to talk about all of the really big ways that the book is totally different to the movie, and at the end, I'll talk about which I think is better and why. Obviously, from this point on, I'm going to be talking about spoilers for the book and the film, so I think that should go without saying, really. But let's get started with one of the biggest differences between the book and the film, and that is the sheriff. In the movie adaptation of Misery, we're introduced to the town sheriff and given a whole new point of view as we witness the sheriff slowly putting together the pieces and tracking down the missing Paul Sheldon. In the book, the entire story is told from the single perspective of Paul Sheldon, and so for much of the story, we don't know if anyone has even noticed that he's missing or if anyone is even looking for him at all. I actually like both of these aspects for different reasons. So in the book, it gives us a much more kind of claustrophobic feeling, as everything is told, for the vast majority of the book, everything is told in just the four walls of this room. And so because you don't know what's happening on the outside, it feels as though Paul is much more isolated, and it fills us with more of a sense of like hopelessness for his situation, which is terrifying. The thing I like about the movie is that with the sheriff and kind of learning about him and his life, his characteristics, he's kind of funny as well, and it's easy, I think, for the viewer to like him and to root for him. So when he shows up at Annie's house, we're afraid for him because we know that Annie is crazy and we like the sheriff, and so we're just like, get out of there, get out of there. But when the trooper, the state trooper, shows up at Annie's house, he's more of like a faceless stranger. We don't know this guy, and so we don't care about him as much because we're not invested in his story. And that brings us to the next big difference, and that is shotgun versus lawnmower. The book, in my opinion, is so much more gruesome than the film. One of the scenes that I think really sets it apart is how Annie handles the trooper when he comes knocking at her door. In the movie, Annie simply takes him out with a shotgun. And, you know, it's not a great way to go, but it's relatively quick when you compare it to how she takes out the state trooper that arrives at her door. This is really gross. In the book, the state trooper gets stabbed, right? Bad enough. And then it's as Paul is watching through the window and he's seeing this man kind of like crawling to try and get to his shotgun. And you're just thinking, is he gonna make it? Is he gonna make it? Where's Annie? What's going on? And then you hear the rumble of a lawnmower. And this part is told in such excruciating detail that actually, should I read a bit? All right, I'm actually going to read a bit of this book, and it's a bit graphic. So if you don't really want to hear it, maybe you're a bit sensitive about it, it's pretty gruesome, then you can skip to the next big difference. It just gets crazier from here on. I think this is going to give you an idea of, yeah, how gruesome this is and why they might not have been able to film it. Bear in mind that at this point, Annie has already chopped off the state trooper's hands, so he's got two stubs, and he's just trying to get away. Let's put my glasses on. Let's take it seriously, shall we? Trying to push himself under the cruiser where she couldn't get him. He didn't even come close. Annie throttled the riding lawnmower up to a scream and drove it over his head. Paul caught a glimpse of the horrified brown eyes, saw tatters of brown khaki uniform shirts hanging from an arm raised in a feeble effort of protection, and when his eyes were gone, Paul turned away. It's gross. Stephen King, man. Nobody can take an innocent life like Stephen King. One of the major differences, I would say, between the movie and the book is how quickly Paul realizes that Annie is crazy. In the opening pages of the book, put the glasses back on, in the opening pages of the book, we get this line. He discovered 3 things almost simultaneously, about 10 days after having emerged from the dark cloud. The first was that Annie Wilkes had a great deal of Novril. She had, in fact, a great many drugs of all kinds. The second was that he was hooked on Novril. The third was that Annie Wilkes was dangerously crazy. That's like, straight away, we read that. And then we've got this much of the book to read after having known she's crazy. I think one of the benefits of a book over a movie is that it's obviously longer. And so a book can very often take its time in revealing characteristics and building up tension as it slowly unravels. And a movie, you know, it has to be feature length, normally somewhere in those days between like an hour and a half to 2 hours. And so what's interesting to me is that it's actually the movie that takes its time in revealing slowly to Paul Sheldon that Annie is crazy, whereas the book gets right into it. That's kind of strange.
It's 2 of the letters in my favorite nurse's name, Annie.
You fooler.
I think this is definitely one of the ways that the movie is better than the book, because in the movie, Paul Sheldon in the early scenes feels very safe and very comfortable, and he's actually quite grateful to Annie for saving him and taking good care of him. And because he feels safe, and we as the audience know, you know, this is a Stephen King story, right? So we know she's crazy, and so we know that Paul Sheldon, who we like in the movie, is in danger. He's vulnerable, and so we're just like, Paul, like, don't trust her. She's a nutter. She's a nutter, mate. And he's just like, oh, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And slowly we start to see the little signs that Annie's a bit, you know, something not quite right. Definitely one of the biggest differences between the movie and the book is in the book that Paul Sheldon is writing. In both the movie and the book, Annie is kind of disgusted by Paul Sheldon's newest book and the manuscript that he's carrying with him. It's called Fast Cars, and she just thinks it's overly vulgar, it's filled with unnecessary bad language.
What do you think I say when I go to the feed store in town? Oh, now, Wally, give me a bag of that effing pig feed and 10 pounds that bitchly cow corn.
But then things go from bad to worse when Annie goes to the store to pick up the final installment of her favorite book series of all time and finds out that Paul Sheldon, her favorite writer, has ended the series with the demise of the main character who Annie just loves. And I mean, she doesn't take it well.
She died. She just slipped away.
Slipped away! You did it! You murdered my misery!
It's at this point that Annie says, no, this isn't the ending. You're writing a new story and you're going to bring misery back. And because the movie is limited in its length, it can't really explore the story that Paul Sheldon is writing. But in the book, because it's much longer and it can spend as much time as it wants on whatever areas that it wants to, we actually get to see the creative process of Paul Sheldon, and we actually get chapters, full chapters of the story that he's writing. I thought this was really cool because it's like we're getting to read a book within a book, and it's like Paul Sheldon and Stephen King are writing side by side, creating something. Yeah, just really effective. I think as well, because we get to see the story of misery in a different font type, it's, I don't know, it just made it feel more authentic, and because of that, the characters felt more real. The next big difference is the sledgehammer and the axe. I think this is probably going to be the biggest difference in a lot of people's minds. I think that there is one difference that's a bit changes the book a bit more for me. In the book, when Annie discovers that Paul has been able to escape from his room and, unbeknownst to her, has been moving around the house in a wheelchair, she feels betrayed, and so she decides, you're not going to be moving around anymore. I'm actually going to amputate one of your feet. And she chops off one of his feet with an axe and then cauterizes the wound with a blowtorch. It's crazy, man. When I read this scene, I felt like I had to put down the book for a little while and just have a cup of tea, take the dogs for a walk in the park, you know, just go and do some nice things. However, in the film adaptation, rather than using an axe, Annie actually uses a sledgehammer to break Paul's ankles. And while this is still shocking and gruesome, and it's filmed in a really effective way, I think the directing in this movie is incredible. I think that it's not quite as gruesome as an axe, mainly because of the finality of it, right? His bones can heal, but he ain't growing his foot back. The next big difference between the movie and the film was Annie's demise. At the end of the story, Paul Sheldon finally gets his revenge on Annie Wilkes and he's able to overpower her. And in the movie version, it's like the climax of a thriller. You know, Annie and Paul are just fighting, and then in a dramatic twist, Annie falls and hits her head on the typewriter. And then just when you think it's over, her eyes snap open, she springs back to life, and then she's taken down for good. So yeah, whereas the movie felt more like a thriller, the book felt more like a horror. In the book, Annie does get knocked out, and then Paul Sheldon kind of passes out as well, but then when he wakes up, Annie's gone. And he's just like, where is she? I don't know where she is. He's freaking out. He starts to believe like she actually is supernatural. She actually is a god. I've miscalculated. She's actually survived and she's always going to be haunting me. But then later on, we discover through the police officers that show up that Annie's body was discovered outside as she was crawling towards the shed to try and get the chainsaw, and that she didn't quite make it to the chainsaw. And it kind of like fills you with horror because you know what her plans were for Paul Sheldon. So, and I just thought that was more effective than a jump scare. Okay, so next up is the biggest difference, in my opinion, between the movie and the book. Before I do that, if you can think of any other differences between the movie and the book that I've overlooked, I'd really appreciate it if you commented down below. I think there's probably a fair few that I've missed out. But let's get on to the biggest difference between the book and the movie, in my opinion, and one that I think just completely changes the entire message of the story. So at the end of the movie, as revenge for making him burn fast cars, which was the manuscript that Paul Sheldon was carrying with him, he rewrites Misery. He rewrites the ending for Misery, and then he holds it up in front of Annie and he sets it alight. And this, if you can imagine, this would be like if George R.R. Martin wrote the end of a Song of Ice and Fire series and then just held it up in front of his fans and just went, Don't worry, that's never going to happen because he's never going to finish it. In the book, he actually doesn't burn the manuscript that he's been creating of Misery, the next installment of Misery. He hides it. And he burns some blank paper to kind of trick Annie. And this, I think, signifies that he really values the work that he's created whilst he's been a prisoner. The reason that I prefer this element in the book rather than, you know, just Paul getting his revenge by burning Misery, I prefer it because one of my favorite elements of the book was watching Paul Sheldon fall back in love with the Misery series and the world that he had previously created. I think it's really the biggest example of character growth in the book. When we first meet him, he hates the series and he kind of hates the fans of the series as well. Like all of the fans, kind of like Annie in a way. He wants to distance himself from this this kind of like trashy romance genre. And he wants to be seen not as a writer of romance novels, he wants to be like a serious writer so that all of his peers will look to him with respect. And his motivations for creating art have kind of been changed in a way. He's not writing out of love and passion for creating literature. He's now writing to be respected. And you know, in my opinion, that's not really a very good reason to create art, for respect. It should really come from something internal. By becoming a prisoner of Annie, it's kind of reignited that old fire. Excuse the pun, I know he's burning the thing. But it's reignited that old fire for creating fiction and just the raw passion of telling a good story. And so I think that was a great and a perfect ending for the book. I think this is something which is probably true of Stephen King as well. Some of his writing can be quite pretty, but I think if you were to ask him what's more important, literary merit or a good story, I don't know for a fact, because I'm not Stephen King, but I bet he would pick the latter 10 times out of 10. And so I think for that reason, the book ending resonated more. And for that reason, I do think that the book is better than the film. But the film is fantastic. The film is phenomenal. If you like these kind of book and movie comparisons, then you might like another one that I've got coming out, and that's the comparison of The Shining book to The Shining movie. There's a lot of big differences between those two, and if you'd like to see that video, then you can click up here. Thanks so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it, and happy reading.